instead of worrying about what you don't have or the thing that you don't get or what someone else has, I would say develop and augment and use the talent and resources for the opportunity that's right here. I know I'm sitting largely in an empty room, but it's wonderful to see 9 people. That's such an improvement, and I look forward to seeing all of you hopefully soon. This has gone on too long. My heart goes out to all the, to people in college enjoying the semester, to seniors in high school whose final semesters just got short-circuited a little bit. And my hope is that, I know it seems big now, that this will be the biggest thing you have to face in your life. That's my hope and prayer. Also want to encourage everyone, and I do this because I do think it's important. As long as you're able, please remain faithful to the church in this time. Even though we're not here normal, some of the operational expenses still go on. And we are in a far better shape than a lot of places to weather the storm, but let's not let this weaken us as we go forward, because there's a lot of things we'd like to see happen. And so continue to stay faithful. I think God will stay faithful to us through this, and in return I'm asking that you stay faithful as well. So you can go online, our website, you can give by credit card or PayPal. There's the mail, we'll be happy to accept them. I know some of you automatically generate your tithes and offerings anyway. So thank you for all that you do. This story this morning is part of a larger unit where we have a series of stories that exist back to back about people who were entrusted with good things, except they never knew when that thing they were entrusted with would be asked for. The next story, we have people who were entrusted with money, though any resource could be used as well in this story. They were entrusted with a great honor. They were either given something of great worth, or they were invited to a great celebration. And they only had one job in either way, and that is to stay ready and to stay faithful for that great celebration, or when that gift they were given would be asked for. Turn to with Matthew chapter 25, if you would. This is a very familiar story. This is a story that Jesus told in his final week. And as we are at Palm Sunday, I think it's worthwhile to talk about it today. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out." "No," they replied. "There may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough." But when they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." The first thing I want to remind us is our supply of oil is everything. So here's my question. What exactly does oil represent in this story? There's no one right answer. It could be a lot of different things. It could be talent and ability. It could be the resources and blessings that we've been given. Could also be grace, the presence of Jesus Christ and His Spirit in our lives. I think maybe especially the last one. I do know that God is willing to supply all of us everything that we need. The supply is limitless, and the only thing that limits that supply is our willingness to ask for it. Our willingness to be open. Often we are unwilling to let God fill us to the level that He would like us to be filled. There's a lot of reasons for that. We have other things to do. We always have other things to do. We always have other priorities in life. And there's always, those priorities are always nosing their way in ahead of Christ. The other temptation we all face, and I'm certainly in this category, is we like it to be self-reliant. We want to supply and make and create our own resources and be the source for everything ourselves. Now, that's certainly better than the alternative, people who are always constantly waiting, never taking care of themselves, never managing their own affairs. But sometimes we can go so self-reliant, we're no longer relying on God. And there's a danger there as well. This whole story flows from the ancient Near East and how they did weddings. First thing they did, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, is often the bride and the groom were not in control over who they got to marry. The families would make the arrangements. Maybe a groom would be a person of means. Maybe they were young themselves. The family was in charge of that process. And they saw a family with a young girl of marriageable age, often 14 or 15 years old. And she became ready to be married. And how one determined that, as soon as they were physically able to bear children, they were of marriageable age. And the families would begin negotiations. It's easy to see what a son brought economically to the life of the family in that day. It was harder to see that for a girl in the home. So how that tended to happen was you paid a bride price for the young lady. Pretty soon, negotiations would be underway, and as soon as the price was met, often it was agreed that this young man and this young woman would be married, and they were betrothed. That's where we pick up the story with Mary and Joseph. Marriage hadn't happened yet, but the agreement was in effect. And what would happen then is they would not pick a day like we do. Right now, boy, we have such a huge checklist we go through. I don't think I'm that old, but I grew up in a time and a place not that far from here where when you got married, you just got married in the sanctuary, and then you moved to the reception hall or the fellowship hall at church for the reception. And I grew up at a time in a place where a wedding reception meant cake and then candy and nuts. If you were really rich, there were finger sandwiches. That's not the case. Now, boy, we have to have the right venue. The venue is everything. You have to pick just the right place. And just the right dress. And you go into great detail about the flowers. And then you have the cake. And there's all these different icings to pick from. I don't know anything. Then there's fondant, right? Am I pronouncing that right? And I think fondant is French for no taste, but that's just me. And it's supposed to be the look of it. And all these things I have absolutely no concept of. We go into great detail for a wedding. Their detail was different than ours. The groom would then say to the bride, and this wording should be familiar to you, I go now to prepare a place for you. And the groom would go back home where he would begin construction, maybe on a separate room on the roof of his family's place, or maybe immediately adjacent, out and back, a connected room. And when that room was done, he would go to pick up his bride. But he wouldn't just come himself, he would have the wedding party. And when the groom got to where the bride was, there would be a week-long celebration of the wedding. The bride's job was to stay ready. And if you're part of the wedding party, your job was to be ready when they came, to go out and greet them and be a part of that. Well, what if the groom came at night, as happened in this case? That nighttime of the groom coming is meant that it was a time that was unexpected. And here's the truth. We do not always know when our supply will be needed. And the truth of the matter is we can never use someone else's oil. We need to be ready ourselves. Does not matter one little bit if our lamp is better, fancier than anybody else's. The question is, does it have enough oil? Oil is that thing on the inside that powers the flame we see on the outside. This is a parable that tells us we need to be internally ready. Because we don't know when that day is we'll need to be ready. One truth we know is that not every person has an equal level of resources. There were different amounts given. In the story that just follows this one, it's a parable of the talents, where the king gave different levels to each one. To one he gave 10, to one he gave 5, to one he gave just 1. They were not judged on how many talents they had when the king came back, but what they did with what they had. We spend too much of our time looking at what everybody else has. And we let the amount that someone else has influence how we feel about ourselves. I suppose this is one of the times I feel kind of fortunate that I kind of grew up where I did. I grew up in a very, very small house. The joke was we had to go outside to change our mind. There just wasn't enough room to do that inside. And so any house is almost bigger than the house I grew up in. And so every house looks nice to me. It's also a lesson I learned very early. I don't know how old I was, 7 or 8 years old. And my friend had an album. And I knew the person on the album. I didn't hear it. I knew the person on the album from the cartoon called Fat Albert. I admit, in elementary school, I had a Fat Albert lunchbox. And this was a Bill Cosby comedy album. And I realized that Mr. Cosby has had some troubles later in life. But that doesn't negate the funniness of the album that I heard. And you've, I'm sure, heard the routine. The routine was the Jell-O sheriff of the house. He had a little brother, and the little brother was always concerned with how much Jell-O that his big brother was having. And the big brother looked at the little brother at one point and said, "Who made you going around here the big Jell-O sheriff of the house?" That was the punchline. We live life that way. We count what everybody else has. We compare ourselves with the level of everyone else. And there's no more damaging thing to do to start comparing ourselves to what everybody else has. There's always going to be someone with more. And just because someone has more does not mean anything bad's happened to me. Our concern at every level is to be faithful with what we've been given. One lesson that I've learned, at least in part, and am still learning every day, is to stay in my lane. There was no good that comes from looking at what someone else does, has, and says, I should have what they have. I should get what they get. I should attain what they've attained. A life lived in that way is a life that's bitter. There are also not only amount questions, I think there are season of life questions. There are places in life where your talent and ability and resources are perfectly matched. Some of those, that might be the parenting years. Some of you, that might be the earning years. Some of you, you might be perfectly fit for the years of wisdom when you can help those generations that follow. We often get so anxious and tied up in a bunch about what is not happening in our lives, we miss the opportunity that perfectly is fit for us at this moment of life. Instead of worrying about what you don't have or the thing that you don't get or what someone else has, I would say develop and augment and use the talent and resources for the opportunity that's right here. Be faithful with your gifts. Be faithful with your resources. Be faithful to the King who gave you the resources as the one who has more resources in store for you. We get so worried we selfishly hoard what we have right now. We have seen lessons of selfish hoarding in the last few weeks. It's not a pretty sight. Here's why all this is important. We have no idea when we will be called to account. My picture behind me is a guy with a sandwich board walking in a big city, and you've seen it. It says, repent or perish. You've seen those guys. They might have a little microphone or bullhorn up on a soapbox and on a corner. I don't think any of them are very effective ever. Now, in a lot of our lives, what that's meant is you've had some preacher get up there and say, hey, listen, you don't know when the Lord's going to come back, and so you need to have everything right with your life. I know when I was younger, I don't know, it seemed like every guest preacher that came to my church had the same story. The Lord wanted someone to dedicate his life to him, and they did not do it. And wouldn't you know, that guy stepped 2 steps out of church and a bus hit him, and he died right there on the bus steps. Everybody knew that story. I didn't know there's so many churches with bus lines running right in front of their door. And it was this big, scary event. And I don't want to do that because I'm not sure that that's that accurate. And I'm not sure that's exactly what the text is talking about. We have no idea when that time is going to be when our talent, our resource, our presence will be needed. I wish I'd kept track of some stories better. We all know names like Dwight Moody and Billy Sunday and Billy Graham and all these famous people. One of those stories is about a guy who taught like junior high boys in a Sunday school class. He was nameless, owned a store. That's all he did. Except maybe he was there in class that one day when the 13-year-old Billy Graham or Billy Sunday or Dwight Moody, or insert your name there, was in his Sunday school class. And maybe the only thing the guy ever did in his life was to shepherd a little kid with one of those names. We have no idea how you have no idea how you fit in God's larger economy. We're thinking a lot about economies right now. One of the things that is making me a little uneasy is how easy certain people are branding essential jobs from non-essential jobs. Well, the grocery store is an essential. What about the factory that makes the cardboard for the boxes that the food comes in? Is that essential? What about the company that services the freezers that keeps the food in the grocery store? What about the company that makes the little widget that goes into the freezer that makes it operate so that the food can go? What about the truck? What about the transportation that gets the widget to the store? Pretty soon, everything's connected. We're all connected. I'm not important. I don't speak in front of crowds. I don't do this. I don't write books. I don't do all these other things. But you have no idea what your presence accomplishes. You have no idea what day, what moment might be the decisive moment for a neighbor or a friend or a family member. My question is, are we celebrating the wedding that's being described in Matthew 25 today? That is a story of these two worlds, the bride's world and the groom's world coming together. That story is a larger meaning. Jesus Christ is the groom. We are his bride, the church. This is a story about heaven and earth being combined, going forward. Are we doing all we can? Are we active in bringing as much as God into our world as we can? At this time, the bridesmaids were needed for the party. They were needed to go out with the bride, and some couldn't because they had more important things to do, and they didn't keep track with what was inside their own lamps. And at the decisive moment, they weren't ready. No, we do not know when the Lord will return. It will be someday. And we do not know when our life will end. We do not know when that decisive moment will happen. I have a schedule. I know how old I am, and I can view the mortality rates and the averages, and I could sit there and go, well, on average right now, I have about 26 years left. But I don't know. I could have 6. I'm not trying to scare anyone. But we have to always be sure that we are ready for that big moment. And also, what if that moment is now? What if you're facing a fork in the road that will determine the rest of your life? Do you make the faithful choice or one that's based on more selfish impulses, and that's determined by the level of resources that you've allowed inside? There's a chance of obedience now, but saying yes now changes your life in ways you cannot appreciate till you get 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, or even more. Maybe the decisive moment is not in your life, but the decisive moment now is the life of someone else. Your word, your response, your reaching out will be the thing that not only determines another life, but their family 2 generations and 3 generations and 4 generations from now. For that family, for that person, I encourage you to be sure your supply of oil is up to date. We're just charged to be ready in every circumstance of life. Be ready. And yes, I'm going back to the 60s and 70s and some of those preachers that came through. What if Jesus returns tomorrow? A possibility. And I'm not discounting that, but that is not how most of us will experience this. Even though that used to be what some of us, that's all we heard 40 years ago, 50 years ago. There will be a day when our life will be demanded of us. And we don't know when this will be. One note. In the last few weeks, I've been a little disheartened because I've never seen such fear in all my life. I am not saying that there's not a rational component to being properly concerned about the things that are out there. Of course, wash your hands, do all the stuff. Yes, all that's wise. But it might be more concerning right now to see, it's a more rational concern to see some of our responses to this. There's part of this that is based on our fear of having anything that could possibly cause us to lose our life that's different from all the other things that we've already baked into the equation. And really, on a statistical model, I'm not going to waste time, our odds really haven't really changed in any appreciable way with things that are going on right now, except our level of fear is just driving this. I've been taking walks with my wife down the sidewalk. I've seen people cross the other side of the street because they don't want to be within 15 feet of anybody. The other day, Friday, I was taking a walk, and it was warm Friday. I thought after all the snow last spring that I'd grown out of my spring allergies. I haven't. And Friday was a mess. I was dripping and sneezing, and people couldn't get out of my way fast enough. I'm not saying not to have proper concerns in every area of life, but I will say this: our lives should not be marked by fear. There are times when expressions of our faith might be demanded of us, and we need people who reflect Christ, especially now, especially in these times. In the week of Easter, and this is Easter week, and this is going to be a different Easter than we've ever faced before. It's going to feel different. It already feels different. It's just strange. Because we really do, and I hope we've learned this lesson, we really do need each other. It's not good to live sheltered lives, sequestered lives. But in this week of Easter, this is a whole bunch of stories about other people who didn't have a good internal supply of oil. And at the moment of testing, they failed. You know some of their names: Peter, Judas, the rest of the disciples. Their faithfulness was tested, and they failed one by one by one. And this Easter, we find ourselves in the midst of a test. This Good Friday should feel a lot like that first Friday, because we're going to be sequestered. We're going to be each alone. The question we have this week, especially now: will our faith shine through? Do we have enough oil internally? Have we allowed the Spirit of God to fill us? Are we being faithful with what we've been entrusted with?